First of all, I would like to thank all of the organizers of this terrific conference for their warm hospitality, to Professor Kravchenko for the kind invitation, and I'd also like to thank the entire CIUS team, past and present, for 40 years of really outstanding scholarly achievement, for 40 years of generous studentship and fellowship support for students and scholars around the world, for 40 years of probably a lot of sleepless nights annotating really rigorously the letters of Volodymyr Vinnichenko or the translation of Mikhail Hrushevsky's История Украины и Руси. And on behalf of the University of Cambridge, I would really like to thank the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies for the past 8 years of your guidance and support, and for offering us a very firm academic ground to stand on. I said the same thing in Harvard a few months ago. It is really impossible to imagine Ukrainian studies without Huri or CIUS. And I'd particularly like to thank the donors who have shared this vision with generations of scholars. So thank you for that support. This panel is entitled Challenges in Ukrainian Studies. I'm from the Midwest of the United States, where we tend to be kind of by nature optimistic, Pollyanna type figures who always are looking for the bright side of things. And I do feel like sometimes cataloging challenges is more or less paramount to shaking your fist at the sky. It tends to be kind of counterproductive. Because after all, and I think a number of the presenters in our first session raised this point, our challenges are really perennial. They are familiar to us. They're largely financial, institutional, and intellectual. They nearly always relate to a familiar problem and failure, I think, in the academy, not in our field actually, but outside our field, to disentangle intellectual merit from rather inert, stale perceptions of political, cultural power. This is a logic that we're very familiar with, a logic by which might is not only right but read. This is a logic that puts us in a position of often having to state the obvious, that Ukraine, the largest country within Europe, the most geopolitically contested country in Europe, is worthy of more advanced study. So when I'm speaking of challenges today, I actually am of the view that we need to be expanding our work in such institutes. I really believe in that, and I will raise a couple of examples, hopefully from the Cambridge case, to illustrate my point. Professor Malgochi earlier mentioned the very helpful questions that we were furnished to help kind of ground our discussion, stimulate thought, and I'm very grateful for those. I want to begin with a question that actually wasn't included, however, and that is the question of disarmed conflict in our work, particularly the ethical consequences of studying a country at war. I think this is a kind of conversation and discussion that we haven't had very often. Ukraine obviously is a place, a country with which we have many, many personal and professional bonds. It's a country that's now subject to consistent political and military aggression. This raises a lot of questions for us professionally that I think we need to tackle. And at least by my lights, we haven't done that yet. I think we can improve in that respect, because if, as Tim Snyder suggested, the Russian annexation of Crimea and the revolution of Ukraine has transformed the world, that's a direct quote, then I think we have to consider and take stock of the ethical implications of that transformation for our work, not only in the realm of our own research or our teaching, but also in the way we reach out to the public, how we, for instance, consult with political analysts, diplomats, and in particular how we relate to journalistic media. That's a really important point that I think we need to take on board. Perhaps it is impossible for us in a venue like this, although I think it's a really welcome suggestion, that we somehow articulate perhaps a really basic, simple message about the mandate and mission of Ukrainian studies at a time of armed conflict. I think it's certainly worthwhile to try to do so. We simply can't conduct business as usual. Certainly, we can hope against hope for an end to this conflict, an imminent end to this conflict, but we need to also be prepared for more escalations. In 2014, we were all caught off guard by the invasion of Crimea by Russian forces. We were thrust in front of cameras. Some of us were media ready, some of us were not. Many of us were in Ukraine, some of us were farther afield. And to speak about a war that's going on as events are unfolding carries tremendous responsibility that we need to support each other in understanding. And that's where I think a venue like this, an institute like this one, is extremely valuable. With that in mind, I would say that I think very practical things like media training are requirements for all of us. That we also need to be building more public-facing online repositories of information about who we are and what we do. This was a point that Professor CUSU made in relation to Facebook, but we all know of the tremendous organic emergence of initiatives like the Ukraine Crisis Media Center, which really filled a vacuum. There are also more local, more modest initiatives, such as the website Ukrainian Scholars in North America that was developed by an environmental scientist based in the United States, Mocher Kodil. These types of initiatives point to a need for us to actually show who we are, what we do, and to consolidate our commentary, and also offer us a venue to share knowledge about editors and producers. In my experience, media studies is really kind of a game of arbitrary interpersonal relations. It's about an assistant to some editor somewhere who is either going to, stick his or her hand into a hat of well-worn names, or going to reach out at the last minute to a university looking for expert commentary so that they can fill a particular hit time. A lot of scholars, I won't name them here, that often represent the Kremlin's point of view are very savvy about these things. I think we can be just as savvy, and that meeting together in this type of context and occasion can offer us perhaps an opportunity to share ideas about how to do so without, again, sacrificing what we're also here to do very clearly, which is to advance knowledge about Ukraine, to conduct our scholarship. Another general challenge to Ukrainian studies that I think has been foregrounded by the Russian-Ukrainian war is something I think psychiatrists often refer to as perseveration. That is, this persistence or repetition of various narratives and frameworks, despite countervailing evidence that actually they're not that applicable any longer or topical. And the kinds of concepts and narratives I'm thinking about are these Huntingtonian concepts of Ukraine as a cleft country. The extraordinary and tragic events of the past 3 years belie this thesis, or at the very least they problematize it hugely. Nonetheless, despite the fact that we see Russian-speaking Ukrainians from eastern Ukraine whose families perhaps took pride in the Soviet legacy, the legacy of the Red Army, have been dying for the sovereignty and independence of Ukraine, we still see this idea sticking around. I've seen it repeatedly in keynote addresses by very well-known and very intelligent historians and political scientists who work on Eastern Europe and Eurasia, who keep speaking about a pro-EU West and a pro-Russian East as if the cliche still matters to us, when in fact we've seen it disproven in many ways. And we also see it from the other side, which is a perception, and I've unfortunately encountered this with some of my students, an expression from our Ukrainian colleagues that somehow Russian is the language of the occupier. It's a tremendously dangerous concept. It's the language of the occupier, it's also the language of the IDP, it's also the language of the patriotic soldier, of the victim in this conflict. So we need to get past a lot of these various narratives. We need to be thinking differently about the way we approach Ukrainian studies. I do think we need to consider approaching and persuading a lot of our colleagues, not simply countering them and correcting them, but really trying to, outside the bounds of Ukrainian studies, reach out in new ways. At a deeper level, I think a large part of this challenge relates to the way we tend to cast Ukraine as an object of knowledge. If we look at English language scholarship on Ukraine, one might say that there's a lot of past, so to speak, in our work, not enough present and future. There's a lot of focus on what rhetoricians call constative rhetoric, assertive rhetoric, rather than on performative rhetoric. There's a lot of focus on meta-narrative and not parology, to use actually a postmodern term. That is, this kind of instrument of knowledge that's comfortable with uncertainty and play. What I'm trying to get at is that actually culture is often left out of the picture in Ukrainian studies. I was very pleased when Professor Magochi mentioned the idea of institutes for music and art. I think that's a tremendously interesting idea. Certainly in Great Britain, this is a problem that's very clear. If one takes just even the most cursory glance at dissertations produced in the United Kingdom, you'll see that the humanities are woefully underrepresented. Beyond a few recent notable exceptions, Ukraine tends to be presented in British scholarship as a creature of politics, of history, of economics, but not culture. Similarly, if one looks at the pages of the Slavic Review, the landmark journal in the field of Slavic studies, at least over the past decade, I think you'll find one featured article on Ukrainian literature. It's on Gogol, of course. I could be wrong about that. Taras Koznarsky would know better than I. But in my exploration of the Slavic Review of the past 10 years, that's as much as I could find. Also, in English language scholarship, we have very little work being done on probably the most successful, the most daring independent theater in Europe. That is Vlad Troitsky's Dach Theater, which has produced Dacha Braka, Dach Daughters, the annual Gogol Fest, which is a major European cultural event. There are no better ambassadors for contemporary Ukrainian culture than the practitioners at Dach. They operate in music, in drama clearly, and also in visual art. But at least to my knowledge, they are largely outside of our scholarly radar, and this is something that we need to address. Now, when I speak about the humanities being woefully underrepresented, I suppose it's understandable because there's certainly a crisis in the humanities more generally. There's a crisis in Slavic studies, and Ukrainian studies, let's say, sits in the interstice between these two areas. But nonetheless, it is quizzical for us in the field of Ukrainian studies. Professor Magochi in the first session suggested that we have perhaps an institute for the study of Ukrainian statehood. Also a really intriguing idea. I would love to pursue it. But it's very hard for me personally to imagine a study of Ukrainian statehood that excludes culture from the picture. Ukraine, in my opinion, owes its existence to culture, to Cossack Dumi, to folk music, to popular ethnography, to romantic poems written in the Ukrainian vernacular that cajoled and invited people to join the Ukrainian national project. This is, of course, why the study of Ukrainian is a sine qua non for any scholar of the country. It's a matter of simple professional competence. If you don't understand Ukrainian, you simply cannot speak or understand the language of the national idea. And I think in the same way, if we don't study Russian, we don't understand this living, breathing, one of the living, breathing languages of Ukraine as well. And the same goes for Crimean Tatar, Yiddish, Polish, and many other languages. We need to create for our students in particular pathways to studying these languages so that we can access this cultural material that shows us something that's not black and white, that complicates the familiar picture. I think students gravitate to this fascinating material. We need to really kind of clear the path for them there. One other thing, and this was mentioned earlier, certainly the study of Ukrainian culture, as we all know, stands in the wake of 2 centuries of colonial exploitation. We can stand here and perhaps debate the existence of Ukraine as a political or an economic colony, but its fate as a cultural colony of its neighbors is not in doubt. And this colonial legacy, I keep feeling comes up in our conversations in ways we don't always understand, very implicitly. I heard it in many ways in the first session. That is, we're constantly dealing with a kind of haunting in which we see a provincialization of Ukrainian culture on the one hand, and on the other hand, a politicization or making political of Ukrainian culture. These are practices that we might say reduce very vibrant, complex cultural figures to either zeros or heroes as people unworthy of study or unassailable beyond various norms. This type of thinking, this bifurcation of thinking can really stifle conceptual innovation. And that's where I want to conclude, because as much as we can, let's say, enumerate these challenges, I think the situation today is really a remarkable opening. It's an opportunity for our scholarly entrepreneurism. I am personally very intrigued by something completely fantastical in the context of literary studies, and that is the application of computational criticism to a large corpus of Ukrainian literature of the 19th, 20th century. Many of you have perhaps heard of Franco Moretti at Stanford, who is pushing large texts, hundreds and thousands of texts through various computers, and seeing very formal features that are not, let's say, apparent to us reading text individually. And we have long been waiting from the Shevchenko Institute of Literature for the preparation and publication of the 100 volumes of the works of Ivan Franko. We're essentially waiting for something that all of us individually can never consume or analyze in any holistic fashion unless we're Yaroslav Retsak, for instance. But imagine taking all these volumes and doing something that Tamara Hundorova has done really admirably in her literary scholarship, combining them with works from Moloda Musa or Volodymyr Vinnichenko and starting to see Ukrainian literary modernism in a new way. That is an extremely exciting possibility. In general, I just want to conclude with, again, a word of thanks and gratitude for the work of all the Ukrainianists and all the supporters of Ukrainianists out there. I think it's a tremendous, uplifting story. We at Cambridge are seeing, in the past 8 years, close to 200 undergraduates who have done Ukrainian. I think there have probably been 2 who have any kind of Ukrainian ethnicity in their background. So there's a lot that we can do, and I look forward to doing with you and with the Canadian Institute for Ukrainian Studies. So thank you very much.
So much, Rory. If Dr. Finnin testifies one new tendency, that Andrei Portnoy is kind of the symbol of the anarchist tendency. Rory is not Ukrainian, but doing Ukrainian studies in Cambridge. Andrei is Ukrainian, born in Eastern Ukraine, raised and born in Ukraine, made his career there, but then later moved to the West, to Germany, to Berlin, and he's doing nowadays his career there. I believe that very efficiently, and this is quite a new tendency, a group of the young Ukrainian scholars who are now normalizing the field, say, in some leading center in the West. Andrei, the floor is yours.